When pitchers and catchers reported about 3 weeks ago, the Orioles entered camp pretty remarkably healthy. Well, that's not the case anymore. I'll get you all the latest updates on injuries to Gunnar Henderson, Grayson Rodriguez, Andrew Kittredge, Jordan Westberg, and more coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, March 7th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, it's going to be mostly injury updates, some positive, most negative, coming out of Orioles camp this week. Gunnar Henderson, Grayson Rodriguez, Andrew Kittredge all seem in danger of starting the year on the injured list, plus some other guys with some bumps and bruises, but I'll get you all the latest updates you need to know. And it's coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started today. So let's jump right into some injury news, because I was planning on this Friday episode kind of being a full recap of the spring training games this week. The Orioles played on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday. I believe actually the game is still going on as I record here on Thursday evening. No broadcast, no StatCast for that one, so not a lot to take away from it. And I was planning on touching on the Gunnar Henderson injury update and getting you the latest on Jordan Westberg, and those things were going to come with this episode, but it was going to be a lot more focused on what had gone on in these spring training games. And then kind of the shoe dropped on Grayson Rodriguez on Thursday, and the tone of this episode definitely shifted. So I'm going to go through the pitching injuries the Orioles are going through, then the hitting injuries, and then we'll talk a little bit about those notes and news from some of the spring training games in the final segment of the show. But let's start with the pitching injuries, and the one that is probably the most concerning for the Orioles right now, and that is Grayson Rodriguez, the injury that kind of prompted switching the gears on this Friday episode. Now, Grayson got the start in Wednesday's spring training game, his second start of the spring. And while we did not have a broadcast, we did have StatCast data for that Wednesday game. So you could see the spin rate, the movement, the velocity on all of Grayson's pitches. And it was quite up and down what we were seeing. He was hitting 95, 96, which is what you kind of used to see or are used to seeing with Grayson. And he has talked about after each of his first two spring starts that he's trying to hold back a little bit more this spring on his velocity, not trying to get up to 95 or 100% effort in spring, looking to hold himself back more. And his velo's been a little bit down. And at that point, you're like, that's kind of normal spring stuff. And when he's averaging 94, when he usually throws 96, that's kind of usual spring training stuff. But he was down at 93. Now, he did throw a pitch at 96, but he was also down at 93 miles an hour. And his final fastball was thrown at 89.5 miles an hour. That is a cause for concern. Now, Grayson came out of the game in the second inning, just kind of seemed to hit around his pitch count. He was pushing towards 40 pitches. He spoke to the media after the game. They obviously asked him about the velocity being down. He basically just said, hey, I didn't feel good today, was feeling kind of sluggish. Ball wasn't coming out of my hand in the bullpen warming up like I wanted to. He kind of talked about how, hey, sometimes you have these days, especially in spring training when you're not all ramped up. And he seemed pretty upbeat about it. And this is a guy who we know has dealt with injuries over the past couple of years and knows his body well. So it felt like someone who, if it was something more than just being sluggish, he may have not talked about that as much with the media, or may have even not talked at all to the media and gone and gotten an MRI or something. But he seemed to be like, hey, it just wasn't my day. I wasn't feeling it. But you were always a little worried about a Grayson Rodriguez fastball, even in spring, that clocks in at under 90 miles an hour. For a guy that throws 96, 97 on the regular, that's quite concerning. But Grayson's words honestly made me feel not super concerned. I was like, hey, he's not trying to throw as hard as he can in spring. He was having a bad day out there. Maybe he will be fine. And the other pitches, the velocity was down. His curveball was sitting 78. It's usually at 81, like the change. Pretty much everything was down across the board. But then on Thursday, we get some more concerning news. Grayson Rodriguez wakes up and he's feeling a little sore in his arm. Now, luckily, it was not the shoulder or the lat, which is an injury he's had twice and the injury that ended his 2024 season. It was not the forearm, which sometimes can be a precursor to the elbow. And it was not the elbow itself either. So in terms of parts of a pitcher's throwing arm that can be sore, tricep soreness is one that's going to end up with generally a better outcome than a lot of those other issues. But it is tricep soreness. And, Brandon Hyde was asked, are you worried? He basically said, hey, I'm worried about every single guy potentially getting injured in spring. And he said, Grayson's going to go in and they're going to look at it. I'm assuming he's going to get an MRI. And he said the Orioles would make more known and would know more on Friday. So sometime after this episode post, we'll probably get a further, more concrete update on Grayson Rodriguez. But it certainly makes you worry. A guy who has had injury troubles throughout his career. Last year was shut down for the final 2 months of the season because of another lat issue. A guy who is going to be counted on this year potentially to break out and be the Orioles ace in 2025. And now you have this issue. And again, it's a tricep issue. We're not talking about something that is elbow, forearm, shoulder, the kind of the big three for pitchers. But it's something the Orioles have dealt with recently. Dean Kramer missed about 6 weeks last season from May until early July with right tricep soreness. Started out as, and then it was a right tricep strain for Dean Kramer. So he had the strain, the injury, basically was out for 6 weeks. So we don't know the severity of Grayson's injury right now. It could be that it's just soreness. They shut him down for a week. He starts throwing, and he could, there's still a possibility he's ready for opening day, or the Orioles say, hey, you're going to pitch game 4 of the season to make sure you're good, but he'll be ready for the first go around of the season. That is certainly possible if it is just soreness. But if they do the MRI and there's some sort of damage, strain, whatever in that tricep, that puts his opening day in doubt, maybe even more so than in doubt. Right now we are now less than 3 weeks away from the Orioles opening in Toronto. And even if you say, oh, Grayson could just pitch the home opener in game 5, you're still looking at 3.5 weeks to get to that point. And if it's any kind of strain or anything, he's just not going to make it back then. He's probably going to have to start the year on the injured list. If it's similar to Kramer's injury, it is some sort of strain. You say 6 weeks. That puts him mid to late April. That's not bad. You're missing 2-3 turns through the rotation, and then you're back to make sure you're healthy. It's something the Orioles can manage. They've certainly brought in a lot of starting pitching depth this offseason, which is going to help them take on whatever this is for Grayson Rodriguez. And if he does have to start the season on the IL, the O's have a guy ready to step in. As we've been talking about the projected rotation and the projected roster for the Orioles, Cade Povich, who has been maybe the O's best starting pitcher so far in spring training, has been on the outside looking in because they had the projected rotation of Eflin, Rodriguez, Kramer, Morton, and Sugano. And then for that long reliever, it was kind of between Albert Suarez or Cade Povich. And because Suarez is out of options, but Povich still has them, and Suarez had pitched out of the bullpen last year, Povich did not, it just made more sense for Suarez to make the team as the long reliever and Povich to, at least for the time being, go down to AAA Norfolk as a starter to begin the year. But if Grayson's going to start on the IL, I would just keep the same bullpen. I would keep Albert Suarez in the bullpen as kind of your long man / swing man. And I would just give Cade Povich the number 5 spot. I would move everybody up. Obviously, if Rodriguez is injured, we would pretty much know Zach Eflin is your opening day starter. I would go probably Eflin, Kramer, Morton, Sugano, and then Cade Povich would start that home opener for the Orioles in game 5 and would begin the year in the rotation. And if Grayson misses 3 starts and then he comes back, if Cade Povich is just kind of fine, you can easily option him to AAA. And if Povich is absolutely dominating and you're like, we can't take him out of the rotation, it's 3 weeks in, those things tend to work themselves out. Maybe it could give him a shot to hold on to a rotation spot if he's really pitching well. So the Orioles have the depth behind it. And again, they would still have Suarez on the team if they needed another starter. Now, the issue then becomes, okay, if Grayson's hurt, Povich becomes your number 5. Suarez still on the roster is your number 6 starter if you need to go to him. But when the Orioles did have a lot of depth starting camp, remember, Trevor Rogers has the knee issue. He's behind. He's not going to be ready for opening day. Chase McDermott has the issue as well. He's a little bit behind. He's probably not going to be ready for opening day. Those guys were part of your starting depth. So if you put Grayson, McDermott, and Rogers on the IL to begin the season, You're then looking at beyond Povich at number 5 and Suarez at number 6. Brandon Young, just added to the 40-man roster, is your number 7 starter to begin the year. And if the rest of the things go well for you, like, he's not going to be needed as a number 7 starter. If you have the 5 that you have, and then you have to go to Suarez, you do, and then you hope you have Grayson Rodriguez or Chase McDermott back if you need them. But with Brandon Young as your 7th starter and really nobody behind him at this point in camp, if Rodriguez does have to miss time, the O's may want to go out and get another depth starter. I mean, probably a guy to sign to a minor league deal as depth. Kyle Gibson and Lance Lynn are the 2 biggest names still out there. Of course, our old friend Kyle Gibson. There's some other lesser names that they could certainly go get. Justin Armbruster is still in big league camp. He's kind of being converted from a starter to a reliever, though. That's certainly something to monitor, but just something to keep your eye on. Maybe the Orioles want to go out and get a little more depth, but they can handle this. Like, Povich is pitching well enough that he's not Grayson Rodriguez. It's certainly a step down in that rotation. But this is why the Orioles went and acquired so much starting pitching depth this offseason. It felt like, Morton was overkill after they'd already gotten Sugano. Well, this is why you do it. And this is why you hold on to Cade Povich and hold on to eventually McDermott and keep Albert Suarez around. You now have this depth, especially if it is just kind of a short-term thing for Rodriguez, misses a couple of weeks at the beginning of the year. You can backfill that. Now, Rodriguez, not the only guy who's dealing with some injuries. Andrew Kittredge, who the Orioles signed to a 1-year, $10 million deal this offseason, reliever who's been great the past couple of years with the Rays and the Cardinals, coming in to help the Orioles at the back end of the bullpen. He's dealing with an injury as well. He was set to come in out of the pen in a spring training game last week, was feeling a little soreness in his knee, decided it would be better he didn't come in the game. Well, it's now left knee soreness and some inflammation for Andrew Kittredge. He has gotten an MRI at this point. The Orioles are kind of getting multiple opinions. And Brandon Hyde also said Thursday that they would have a more definitive answer on Kittredge on Friday. So we're going to learn more about Kittredge and Rodriguez on Friday. So probably next week on the pod, I'll dive even deeper into what this means. But for Kittredge, he's into his mid-30s now. He's got a knee issue. It's not something you want to play around with. Also, a very distinct possibility, similar to Rodriguez, that Andrew Kittredge could start the year on the injured list. Now, the Orioles have some depth in their bullpen. And what I think this would do is have the door be wide open for Brian Baker, who I continue to talk about, had another great outing earlier this week, 1-2-3 on Wednesday. He has retired all 9 batters he has faced this spring. His fastball velo is up to 98. He's found a new changeup grip that works. Brian Baker is looking like the old, really good 7th inning guy, 2022 Brian Baker we saw in his first stint with the Orioles. And we've talked about how guys like Colin Selby and Matt Bowman and others would be in line for a bullpen spot if one did open up. But I think right now Baker is the leading candidate because Selby has options. He's already been sent to minor league camp. Bowman's on a minor league deal, so he can just be sent back down to Norfolk. But Brian Baker, for the first time, is out of options. So if he didn't make the team, the O's were going to have to put him on waivers. And Rock Kabako of Masson reported this week that other teams have been monitoring Brian Baker because he's been so good and knowing he's in a roster crunch, thinking the Orioles may look to trade him near the end of spring training. But now with this Kittredge issue and the Grayson Rodriguez issue, and there's still a couple of questions about Felix Bautista, Baker may be needed to be in the opening day bullpen. And who knows, 2 weeks after that, if Kittredge is back, if they do have to eventually DFA Baker. But he's pitched well enough that, it's been rough the last couple of years, but he is earning himself a spot, especially if Kittredge is leaving an opening. Now, if the O's still don't feel good with Baker, or if it's more of a long-term thing for Kittredge, which you hope not, but it's a possibility, not a lot of great relievers remaining on the free agent market, but a guy I've been all over trying to get the Orioles to sign for the last 3 years is David Robertson. He's going to turn 40 in April, but David Robertson, he had a 3 ERA, 2.65 FIP, 33% K rate to a 9% walk rate in 72 innings out of the bullpen for the Rangers last year. He was awesome for the Rangers bullpen in 2023, helping them to go and win a World Series. Robertson's been great the last couple of years, even though he's into his late 30s and about to turn 40. I would go get him on a 1-year deal. I can't believe he's still out there. Maybe it's because he has an injury too, and that's why he's still unsigned here in early March, but that is another potential fix. Now, speaking of the bullpen, let's end the pitching injuries on a high note, because Felix Bautista pitched in a game for the first time since August of 2023. He did it on Monday. Game was broadcast on Mass in the spring training game between the O's and the Red Sox. And it was just awesome to see him out there. He threw all 3 pitches, which was great. The fastball, the splitter, and the slider. The fastball was hopping. It wasn't his usual velocity. He was sitting 96, to 97 miles an hour. We're used to him being 99 to 100, but still had that ride on it, still had good velocity. Splitter looked great. That pitch was 85, 87. It's usually 88, 89. And again, he's still ramping up in spring. This is not really an issue with the velocity being down. Struck out Trace Thompson with a good fastball, Nate Eaton with a nasty splitter, and got David Hamilton to ground out on a splitter. 13 pitches, 1-2-3 inning, mostly through strikes. And Brandon Hyde did talk about it and say, like, hey, he's going to ease Felix Bautista in early in the season. That's something we've known. It's something Elias has talked about this offseason. But Brandon Hyde finally came out and said it definitively, which is something I've assumed and talked about on this podcast already. Bautista, at least early in the year, won't go multiple innings at a time in one appearance. He'll be held to one inning and no back-to-backs, right? He won't pitch on back-to-back nights. That's something we figured was going to happen anyway. And Hyde basically said, hey, we're going to do that early in the year to make sure he's good. And then we can kind of fully let him loose in the second half and hopefully in the postseason. And we can get back to full Felix then. But even a reserved and held back Felix Bautista is still one of the best relievers in baseball. And at this point, he is trending to being ready for opening day. And how fun would that be for the Orioles? But those are the pitching injury updates. Unfortunately, the hitting ones aren't much more positive. We'll get to them, including Gunnar Henderson, unfortunately, being on this list. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game. So even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. Now, FanDuel's live betting feature is great because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. You feel like you never miss your chance. And plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. And right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That is FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So from pitching injury news, we move on over to hitting injury news. Now, not as good. I would say probably a little more positive than the pitching one. I just think there's a level of concern right now from Grayson Rodriguez that maybe there's not as much with the other guys who are injured. But let's start with Gunnar Henderson. Now, Gunnar last week left the game in the first inning with what the Orioles called right side discomfort after kind of leaping for a ball at shortstop. They said he was fine. They said he wasn't getting an MRI, but well, apparently he got an MRI because the Orioles announced earlier this week that Henderson has a, quote, mild right intercostal strain. Now, Brandon Hyde said the Orioles are, quote, very, very hopeful that Gunnar Henderson will still be ready for opening day. And an intercostal muscles is kind of like up by in your rib cage, helps with breathing. So it's certainly got to be an uncomfortable injury, even if it's just kind of sore and there's not anything structurally wrong. But that is an injury that the Orioles are not going to push. Now, it's something Gunnar Henderson did deal with last spring. Remember, he had a little bit of an oblique issue when he was ramping up, didn't start playing in spring games till right around now, first week of March. And he was still good and was ready to go for opening day 2024. Brandon Hyde did also say, despite saying, hey, he's got this issue, that he is already improving. Like he's already been on the track of getting better and better every day. He's still not playing back in spring training games yet. But I still think with Gunnar, with what the Orioles have said about him so far, I still think there's a better than 50% chance he's going to be on the opening day roster. But if he does have to start the year with maybe just a quick 10-day IL stint to make sure he's okay, check out last Friday's episode. I did a full breakdown of what the Orioles would do with the roster if Gunnar were on the IL. But basically, like Jordan Westberg would probably play shortstop, Jackson Holliday would play a lot of second, and Ramon Urias would play third. And then in terms of the roster spot, it does open up a potential lane for Kobe Mayo to make the opening day roster because he doesn't kind of have that lane right now. But I think it would be more likely that someone like either Luis Vasquez or Livan Soto makes the roster, two guys with a lot more defensive shortstop experience, two guys who have really impressed so far in spring. Brandon Hyde had some really positive quotes, I believe, on Thursday about both of those guys, Soto and Vasquez. I've been super impressed, especially by Luis Vasquez. I've mentioned him multiple times on the show. I think because both of them can play shortstop, it just gives you a backup shortstop option on the bench for a week or so until Gunnar would come back is probably what they would do. But the big thing is that Brandon Hyde said Henderson is improving with the injury, and hopefully we see him back on the field maybe next week or the week after and gets himself in a couple of games to be ready for opening day. Now, Tyler O'Neill is a new addition to this. O'Neill, who was sick last weekend, missed a day of camp. A lot of sickness has been going through the Orioles camp, but he was, this is a new one. He was scratched from Thursday night's lineup in the Orioles Grapefruit League game with left rib cage soreness. Now, the Orioles said he was removed as a precaution. That is what you usually say for spring training injuries. That's what the Orioles said when Gunnar Henderson was removed from the game. It turned out to be at least something that was notable that could cause him to start the year on the IL. And even though it is precautionary and it was a late move and it's spring training, so you're always going to be way more safe than you ever would be in the regular season. You're not going to make anybody push through anything. It is Tyler O'Neill. And as we talked about, when the Orioles signed him to a 3-year deal this offseason, he has been very, 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 very injury prone throughout his big league career. That has been the one downside of O'Neill. When he's been healthy, he's been great at times. He just can't stay on the field. And even an injury this small just makes you worry about a guy like O'Neill who has had so many issues injury-wise in his past. So if a guy like O'Neill has to start the year on the injured list, you're probably looking at, against right-handed pitching, your main outfield is Colton Cowser in left, Cedric Mullins in center, and you're going to see a lot more Heston Kjerstad in right field. And then when left-handed pitchers are out there, Ramon Laureano would be in the starting lineup, probably over Mullins, but would sometimes start over Kjerstad as well. You're still going to see Cowser in there every single day. And there would be one roster spot open. Now, it's possible that is another way that Coby Mayo could slip onto the opening day roster to get another right-handed hitter in there with O'Neill out, a righty who mashes lefties. But Mayo doesn't play the outfield, and it would still be a tough fit for Mayo to get him at bats. They'd probably rather him just get regular at bats in AAA Norfolk. So I really think either Daz Cameron or Dylan Carlson, the two outfielders on the roster right now, would be up for grabs for that final spot. I just think that even though Cameron is a right-handed hitter who hits lefties well and Carlson's a switch hitter, Carlson is much better from the right side. And I just think because Carlson is on a major league deal and is on the 40-man roster and Daz Cameron is not on the 40-man, it would also be easier to give Carlson that roster spot. And again, if it's something where O'Neill's going to be out for 2 weeks and then he comes back, I think the Orioles who signed Carlson would be totally fine rostering Dylan Carlson, playing him a few times a week until Tyler O'Neill would get back. But I think it would be between Cameron and Carlson and probably leaning towards Dylan Carlson to get that roster spot if O'Neill is on the IL. And the Orioles, I mean, if you sign Tyler O'Neill to a 3-year deal, you're going to have him miss some time. That is where having Heston Kjerstad hopefully healthy and ready to go, he can step in and play almost every day against righties, against lefties. It would be a real shot for him to get some big at-bats in early in the season. But we did make it all the way through the bad injury news. Just like there was some good news pitching-wise with Felix Bautista, there's good news on the hitting side. Jordan Westberg returned to the lineup on Thursday. Westberg, who played in the Orioles' very first spring training game, all the way back on February 22nd, and then had not appeared in a game since because he was having some lower back issues, got back into the lineup starting at second base on Thursday night. Really, really good sign to just see him in there and healthy. And an interesting story. A couple of outlets wrote about it this week. Westberg admitted that the back soreness was due to his bed in his Airbnb. He said the mattress in his Airbnb was way too soft. He's used to sleeping on like a rock hard bed when he's at home. And he just thought, I'd be fine with a softer bed. And he was not. His back did not work out. It did not respond kindly to that new bed and caused some soreness. He said he has gotten a new mattress topper to put on the bed and it feels much better, much more like his bed at home. He's sleeping better. The back is improved and he is back in the spring training lineup. I was a little bit worried because back issues are back issues, but the fact that it was more of a sleeping wrong thing than a, hey, I got injured in a game thing tells me he should be good to go. We'll obviously continue to monitor it, but now that he is back in spring training games, you can assume Jordan Westberg will be good to go in that Orioles lineup every single day, trying to repeat his all-star season when we get to opening day less than 3 weeks from now. But Always funny injuries out there in spring training too, and that is one of the more interesting ones with Jordan Westberg on the Airbnb bed. Airbnb better watch out. Maybe not a 5-star rating coming their way. Now, not getting to as much game notes as I thought I would, but still a chance in the final segment to get to a couple of things that caught my eye in the spring training games this week, and that is coming up next to finish off the show. So to cap things off on a Friday episode, just want to get to a few things from the 3 spring training games so far this week on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday that were at least somewhat notable for me as the Orioles continue to go through this Grapefruit League schedule and unfortunately aren't getting through it completely healthy, but they are playing games and there are guys who are intriguing me when they are out there. Let's start with Adley Rutschman, who hit his first home run of the spring back on Monday off of Hunter Dobbins, kind of a hanging high breaking ball, just kind of roped it over the right field fence. Then he had 2 more hard hit singles on Wednesday. One of them was 103 off the bat versus Joan Duran, one of the best closers in baseball. Had an infield single Thursday. I believe he's now 8 for 16 in spring. That is pretty good for Adley Rutschman. You love to see him looking healthy and swinging the bat well. Heston Kjerstad stole second base on Monday, which allowed a run to score from third when the throw kind of got away. Kjerstad has some of the sneakier speed you'll ever see just because he doesn't run very gracefully. He doesn't look like he's built to have speed. But per StatCast last year, Heston Kjerstad was in the 81st percentile in Major League Baseball in sprint speed. That is like, if you're 80th percentile or above, that is really good speed. And that is what Kjerstad has. Now, he looks a little awkward getting to the speed, but maybe this is something where Heston Kjerstad could steal some bases. A lot of Orioles have talked about it. Jackson Holliday wants to steal 20 bases. Brandon Hyde has talked about how he wants the Orioles to be more aggressive on the base paths. Kjerstad stole 1 base all of last year in the majors, 2 in AAA. He's already stolen 2 in spring. He did steal 5 in the minor leagues in 2023. Like, he's a guy who has that in his bag of tricks, I think, and we just don't think of it that way. Maybe that's another way for Kjerstad to get himself in the lineup more and more. If he can steal some bases, look out for that this spring for the Orioles. Now, Jackson Holliday, again, I did a full episode on Jackson on yesterday's pod, so make sure to go back and check that one out. But Jackson Holliday had 4 hard hit balls on Wednesday, all balls in the air that did unfortunately turn into outs for him. But 8 of his 15 tracked StatCast balls in play this spring have been hard hit. That is 53%. That is Gunnar Henderson level of hard hit rate. Awesome sign for Jackson Holliday. And then on the pitching side, like Tomoyuki Sugano and Charlie Morton both looked really solid in Monday's game. They kind of piggybacked off each other to get that work in because the Orioles had an off day in spring on Tuesday. So had they played, it probably would have been, Morton Monday, Sugano Tuesday, but they just got them both in Monday's game. And then Albert Suarez pitched on Wednesday and was a lot better. Got his pitch count up to 55, threw more strikes, got 10 swings and misses. He was throwing his cutter harder because he's got that new kind of slurvy breaking ball. And I think with a harder cutter, he was more like 89 instead of his usual 86, 87 on the cutter in terms of miles per hour. That allows him with a new breaking ball that's also moving right to left to give more differentiation between the cutter and that new slurve. I think that's on purpose from Suarez. And that was nice to see in the StatCast data, which we had. We didn't have a broadcast. We did have StatCast from the Orioles Wednesday spring training game. So definitely good news for Suarez, who had a rough couple of outings to begin the spring, looking a lot better and looking poised to, be in that bullpen. And hey, if Grayson does start on the IL, again, I would rather the Orioles give the job to Cade Povich, but it's still possible that Albert Suarez would then kind of slot into that number 5 role. And maybe Povich could begin the year in the bullpen. Certainly a possibility as well. But that'll do it for today. That'll do it for this week on the show. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen. Leave a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps the show. Also, if you could like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page, that helps us too. And if you have any thoughts on the show, mailbag questions, whatever it may be, just want to talk some ball, you can email me, lockedonorioles@gmail.com. That'll do it for the week. The Orioles have some more spring training baseball this weekend. Exciting here on Friday night. The Orioles are on MLB Network, which is cool. There's also StatCast of this broadcast against the Tigers. Dean Kramer takes the hill for the Orioles. Then on Saturday, unfortunately, there's only a radio broadcast, no StatCast, no video. But on Sunday, the Orioles are playing a split squad game. They are at home against the Twins. That, again, only has radio, no StatCast, no broadcast. But they're on the road against the Phillies in a split squad. That game will be broadcasted by the Phillies, and it will have StatCast. Tomoyuki Sugano is in that game. So I will be back on Monday, recapping everything you need to know from the 4 Orioles spring training games over the weekend, and of course, getting you any further updates, because of course, we're going to hear more about Grayson Rodriguez and Andrew Kittredge here on Friday. But that's coming up on Monday's episode. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.